In today's video, I'm going to walk you through the process of how I made my largest round epoxy river table to date, and also explain the huge mistake I made that almost cost me this sale. This build was for a client in Scottsdale, Arizona, and they wanted a large 75-inch round epoxy river table for their dining room. So I took a trip to my favorite place for live edge slabs, Street Tree Revival in Anaheim, California, to show the client the current inventory.
This one. So this would all be epoxy.
After sending them some videos and looking at a few options, we decided on these two book-matched American elm slabs.
Right now we have them laid out. We are going to draw kind of a rough circle and then cut it down to size, for one, so it's easier to work with, and then two, also fit in my car. But then also we're going to get them both flattened out, and I don't need the cutoffs flattened necessarily, so it'll just be easier on the machine doing that. So right now we put some of these bars down the middle here to kind of give us a platform to put the like a middle piece in the center, and then we're going to attach a string and then draw out a circle larger than the actual table. So the table we're building is going to be a 75-inch round. So we're building we're cutting out about a 77-inch round table roughly, and that's about as big as the river is going to be. And so let's get to it.
Once the circle was sketched out, I handed the slabs over to John, who is a wizard with the chainsaw, and he got to work on rough cutting them down to these half-moon shapes. After that, we moved them over to the Wood Whiz to get them perfectly flat so I can take them back to the shop. At the shop, the next step was to clean up all the bark and loose fibrous layers. For this, I like to use a number of tools, including chisels, nylon wire wheels on my drill, and this tool called the Restorer. You can find links to all the tools and products I use on this build in the description. And if you notice, there are two little cuts in each slab. I'll explain what these are a little later in the video, but I used them as an accent feature with some brass inlay. I think it looked pretty cool in the end. Once the live edge is cleaned up, I seal the edges with a thin layer of epoxy and let that cure for at least 24 hours. And then prior to the epoxy pour, I'll just scuff up the live edge with one of my wire wheels on my drill. Next up, we need to build a big, round epoxy mold. For this, I use 3/4-inch melamine that I fused together, making sure I seal the joint with some caulking and tuck tape. And as you can see, I also screwed on a wide strip of melamine here to not only hold the two bigger pieces together, but my thinking was that this piece would provide a cross support to prevent any bowing during the pour. Once the circle was cut, flipped it over, cleaned up the live edge with a flush trim bit, and then proceeded to attach some landscape edging. This is the same stuff you'd find in the garden section of your local big box store or garden center. Just be sure to grab the one made of composite material. Now we're ready for the epoxy pour. So prior to pouring, I sprayed 2 coats of epoxy mold release spray wiping it down in between with a paper towel to help spread the spray and also ensure it covers the entire mold. So for the pour, I use 9 gallons of super clear epoxy liquid glass tinted with their black pigment. And once poured, I made sure to keep the room cool and also put a fan on it. And then I let this epoxy cure in the mold for at least a week before I removed it. Luckily, I had no issues with the mold separating from the epoxy, but this is when I realized there was a mistake. When I poured the epoxy, I had the mold sitting on a couple of sawhorses, and like I mentioned before, I thought that wide strip of melamine underneath, along with positioning the slabs perpendicular to the seam in the mold, would have been enough to prevent any bowing. But it wasn't. The weight of the epoxy was too heavy, and I should have had the mold on a flat surface supporting the entire thing. Now, I wanted to see if we could still move forward, so I brought the whole thing back to Street Tree Revival to get it flattened. The bow was so big that if I were to completely flatten the whole thing, the table would have been too thin and definitely warp over time. The solution we thought of was to flatten the bottom side just enough to accommodate the table base, and then proceed to flatten the top completely. This left us with some tapered sides, and it's not a bad look, but obviously not what was intended. And fortunately, after explaining to the client what happened, the client was okay with this and still gave me the green light to continue. So next time, I would just make sure the mold is supported entirely on a flat surface, and also maybe start with thicker slabs to have some more room for any errors. Back at the shop, I can cut the table to its final size and start routing out the bottom to recess the table base. As you can see, there is still a lot of epoxy on the bottom that does need to be sanded off. But it was important to make sure I waited to sand it all off until after I routed the recess, because all of that epoxy was necessary to ensure that the tabletop would sit flat on the base. After the recesses were routed, I could then begin the very, very long process of sanding all that excess epoxy off. Remember those 2 cuts on the live edge? These cuts were done by an arborist while the tree was still alive. And I was told this was to prevent the spread of Dutch elm disease. I left them in because 1, I really liked the shape of the live edge on this section of the slab. And 2, I thought if we were to accent these cuts with some brass inlay, it would draw some attention to the provenance of where these slabs came from. So this was my first time doing inlay, and I have to say it was much easier than expected. Brass is not only a beautiful metal that I think works really well with wood, but it was pretty easy to cut and sand. For the finish, we did 2 coats of Rubio Monocoat. The first coat we did in their black pigment to help darken up the elm a bit, per the client's request, followed by a second coat in their original pure formula. And that's it, my largest round epoxy river table with brass inlay. Even though I made a pretty big mistake, I was able to push through, find solutions, and learn from it. A big thank you to the client for still giving me the green light and trusting me to finish this project. And if you found value in this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And I hope you guys won't make the same mistakes I made. Till next time, thanks for watching.